Our presentation is over race in the juvenile justice system. First off, let's define the juvenile justice system. It is responsible for controlling and correcting the behavior of troubled juveniles. When we look into the juvenile justice system and how races coincide with it, we can see that the majority of juveniles that are in the system are of the minority group. In an article about racial disparities in the juvenile justice system, it states that according to the MacArthur Foundation, youth of color constitute approximately 1/3 of the adolescent population in the U.S., but 2/3 of incarcerated youth. That statement alone proves the disproportionality. Minority groups have a high possibility of also being in poverty, which has a lifelong negative effect on those children. Examples of these negative effects are the child's cognitive achievement, educational attainment, social behavior, etc. Children who live in poverty have to learn to grow up at a faster rate. Education also plays a big role in these children's lives. Without a proper education, children will not learn to properly contrast between rights and wrongs, and children placed in low poverty schools do not have the same privileges as children in better areas. Schools that are in a poverty-ridden neighborhood do not always get the same resources. Some of these resources are higher curriculum, better teaching staff, and more advanced classes. All of these things collectively can make a juvenile feel the need to turn to crime. Racism among minority groups have a history in the U.S. Over the years, we have seen hate crimes against the justice system. Racism is nothing new in society. Examples of racism in history are slavery, immigration, and civil rights. Everyone who has taken a history class knows what slavery is and what it means to be African American in history and unfortunately also in today's society. African Americans have varied from rebelling against the justice system, accepting what is happening, even if it's not great, to developing a hostility against the justice system. The questions people have about the equality among the minority groups is something the justice system needs to take into consideration. People of the minority groups and people in poverty in general have been stereotyped throughout history, specifically in the media today, and has transgressed even in today's society. Findings from research titled Racial Disparities and the Punishment of Youth on Racial Disparities in Juvenile Justice Outcomes are mixed and cause minority overrepresentation in juvenile justice and remains unclear. The results feature studies to predict whether or not race matters. Race effects are not contingent upon whether or not studies control for differences in the seriousness of offending. The findings offer support for a structural perspective on the role of race in juvenile justice and suggest that the punitive treatment is more clearly associated with being Black rather than non-white. To get a better perspective on the competing perspectives, we got information from a more biased article that suggests that, according to Karen Harp, President Trump's administrator, the states have been spending too much time and money compiling data without improving real-life outcomes. Harp feels every issue of juvenile justice, including racial disparities, should be looked at through the lens of public safety and offender accountability. Youth advocates counter by working to keep juveniles of color out of lockup. According to an analysis of federal data, Black children get into fights, steal property, carry weapons, and use and sell drugs at the same rate as white children, but get disproportionately policed for it. Current issues and events. I feel like it is necessary to mention Black Lives Matter. In recent years, there has been a social movement of Black Lives Matter that campaigns against violence and systematic racism towards Black people. Black Lives Matter regularly holds protests speaking out against police killings of Black people and broader issues such as racial profiling, police brutality, and racial inequality in the United States criminal justice system. I feel like this is important for race in the juvenile justice system because it all began with the shooting of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Black Lives Matter became nationally recognized for its street demonstrations following the 2014 deaths of 2 African Americans, including 18-year-old Michael Brown, which resulted in the protests and the unrest in Ferguson. Other current events and issues involving juvenile justice system and race is the automatic transfer reforms that started January 1st, 2016 that eliminated the automatic transfer for children aged 15 and under to adult court and expanded juvenile discretion. Also, raised the age juvenile court to bring 17-year-olds charged with misdemeanors back to juvenile court in 2010. In 2013, it raised the age of juvenile courts to bring 17-year-old charges with felonies back to juvenile courts. As of January 1st, 2014, 17-year-olds are tried in juvenile court instead of the adult system. Juvenile drug transfer reform. In 1985, Illinois' drug transfer laws required 15 to 16-year-old charges with drug offenses within 100 or 1,000 feet of a school or public housing to be tried in adult court. When the existence of disproportionate racial representation is present in the juvenile justice system, it raises questions about fundamental fairness and equality of treatment by those youth by the police, the courts, and other personnel connected with the juvenile justice system. The juvenile justice system and how the youth are treated have subsequent effects on the youth. In 1988, the JJPD, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, conducted a study to determine three things. Does disproportionate minority confinement exist in the juvenile justice? They tried it again in 1992 and upgraded it. They determined that it does exist, but what is causing the issue, and what are some corrective strategies to implement? Since then, we have learned that it does exist, and there's many reasons for this to be an issue. Labeling theory is very important to look at when discussing how or why there is this prejudice in our juvenile justice system. Since 2/3 of our incarcerated youth are minorities, the labeling theory suggests that social control leads to deviance, and if you label a delinquent child, it can result in that child becoming delinquent. Also, correcting must start at a community level, which I will get into more during the suggestions for improvement. These are the race and ethnicity patterns of juvenile justice. For homicide, Black youths are the highest overrepresented, Latino youth are overrepresented in some cities, and Native Americans are overrepresented as well. For non-lethal violence, Black youths are the most overrepresented. Property crime, overall minimal differences across groups. Alcohol violations, white and Native American youth are overrepresented. Drug abuse violations, Black youths are overrepresented again. Self-reports contradict arrest data. White youths report higher levels for drug abuse. Weapon violations, Black youths are overrepresented again. So how this has all impacted society. Going back to Black Lives Matter for a second, when we talked about media at the beginning of the semester, we talked about it in a really negative light and how it has shown minorities and people in poverty in a negative way. But on a more positive side of the media, it has allowed for people, specifically Black people, to tell their story. Another way that has impacted society is the establishment of the Juvenile Justice Initiative, which launched in 2000 as a collaborative of the Woods Fund of Chicago, along with John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, during the tenure of President Barack Obama's on the Woods Fund board. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, statewide advocacy organization that establishes collaborations to achieve improvements and to change for youth in the juvenile system. The Juvenile Justice Initiative has successfully advocated for numerous reforms in Illinois and have positively impacted children in conflict with the law. So how this has all impacted the criminal justice system. States have recognized children who commit crimes are different than adults and are less blameworthy and have a greater chance of change. In 1920, every state in the country established separate systems of criminal justice designed to acknowledge differences between the juvenile justice system. In 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Galt, the U.S. Supreme Court determined the Constitution requires youth to be charged with delinquency in juvenile court. It was also deemed that they have many rights of adults to include right to an attorney and right to confront witnesses. The U.S. Supreme Court extended additional rights to include charges to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt and right against double jeopardy. At least 15 states in the past decade have enacted legislation identifying and addressing overrepresentation of minorities in the juvenile justice system. Racial impact statements are requiring a statement much like a fiscal impact statement for proposed legislation that examines the impact of sentencing or parole changes on racial and ethnic minorities. Committees or commissions to address racial and ethnic disparities. They establish committees or commissions to address the remedy of overrepresentation of minorities in the juvenile justice system. Cultural competency training for law enforcement. That requires cultural competency model training for all law enforcement officers assigned to public school buildings. Standardized data collection. It requires some sort of standardized collection of ethnic and racial data on individuals arrested or committed to the Department of Juvenile Justice. Race-neutral risk assessments. It requires juvenile justice and probation staff to use race-neutral risk assessments, instruments to eliminate racial and ethnic bias in detention screening. And then below we have the states that require impact statements listed. The states created that created the committees or commissions to address racial and ethnic disparities. The states that require cultural competency training for law enforcement. Georgia requires race-neutral risk assessments, and the states that require standardized data collection. So some suggestions for improvement. The first thing is to acknowledge that there is much more room for improvement, especially with disproportionate minority confinement. We have improved a lot, but we are nowhere near where we need to be. Alternative sentencing. Incarceration for juveniles should be like a last-ditch effort, especially when considering labeling theory. If a child gets in trouble for the first time and is incarcerated, they're going to think of themselves as a delinquent and are going to be looked at as a delinquent pretty much for the rest of their lives. Many different alternatives should be used before resulting in incarceration. Start from the community, which basically means that we need to invest in libraries, parks, community centers, and schools, and that will help more prevent crime rather than dealing with crime after the juveniles have already gotten in trouble. Another thing is hiring minority police officers. That would be beneficial in many different ways, but would also get children who normally wouldn't trust police officers to trust cops more if they were happen to be of the same race. Going off that as well, having police in schools, like the picture that I posted, having police in schools, whether for DARE or security guards, having them being involved with the children and talk to the children will eliminate a lot of the scariness between both the cop and the child. So in conclusion, it has been established that minority youth are confined disproportionately. I think that acknowledging that it is real and that it is a problem is the first step in bettering it and bettering our community. Starting from the community will help tremendously, whether that is investing in our libraries, parks, schools, etc., or community policing, or just working on things yourself. I think that is the #1 way to start helping. And then consistently working towards ways to better our justice system and the lives of our children will benefit everybody involved. Thank you for listening.